I'm just weighing my options.
The plan makes sense, and we're always here to help.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Executives Club of Chicago and to today's program, the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer. I'm Tony Spall. I'm the chair of Energy BBDO and the immediate past chair of the club. I want to thank you all for joining us today on this snowy day that we didn't have to go out for. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, BMO Harris, and to our silver sponsors. Thank you, Northern Trust, Packed with Purpose, Ulta Beauty, and William Blair. We're very grateful for your continued support of the club. Now, to make sure you all have an excellent technical experience with us today, I want to give you a 2-second tutorial on the GoToWebinar platform. If you go to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll notice a quotation bubble icon where you'll be able to, if you click on that, you'll be able to ask our panelists questions. And there's also a paper icon. If you click on that, it'll give you access to our handouts, which include today's agenda. Should you have any problems whatsoever, email programs@executivesclub.org, programs@executivesclub.org, and a member of our team will be with you to assist immediately. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Richard today on what is the 21st Annual Trust Barometer, and also to hear from our expert panel led by the wonderful Jim Kirk. They'll delve into the implications of the findings for all of us. So now here to say a few words and to introduce our keynote speaker is Daryl Hackett, President, BMO Wealth Management US. Daryl?
Thank you, Denise, and greetings, everyone. On behalf of BMO, it is an absolute pleasure to participate again as a sponsor for this great event. And as highlighted earlier in our video, 2020 was clearly a year that forced us to make adjustments and to pivot. Now that we are well into 2021, we have an opportunity to take the lessons learned from the challenges we faced last year and turn them into positive outcomes. Today's discussion is designed to help us chart the path forward, and I want to thank all of you for not only participating, but for caring. Today, I'm excited to have the opportunity to introduce Richard Edelman, CEO of the global communications firm, Edelman. Richard has extensive experience in marketing and reputation management, having led assignments with major corporations, non-governmental organizations, and family businesses in over 25 industries around the world. Under Richard's leadership, the agency has garnered many of the industry's top accolades, including being named PR Agency of the Decade by both Advertising Age and the Holmes Report. Richard himself has also earned many industry honors. Last year, Richard was inducted into the American Advertising Federation's Advertising Hall of Fame. And in 2019, he was named the PR Agency Professional of the Past 20 Years by PR Week and inducted into their Hall of Fame. He's regarded as an industry thought leader and serves on the board of directors of the Ad Council, the Atlantic Council, Project Hood, P33, the Gettysburg Foundation, the 9/11 Museum, and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Richard, what do you not do? As the creator of the annual Edelman Trust Barometer, Richard is one of the foremost authorities on trust in the business, government, media, and non-governmental organizations. And today, he will share the findings from the 21st Annual Trust Barometer report. So let's get the discussion started. And with that, I would like to hand the mic over and welcome Richard. Over to you.
Daryl, thank you. First of all, let me just commend your financial institution for what you're doing for Chicago. Your commitment to small business and medium-sized business is just epic. And, you know, you embody trust in my mind. Okay, let's get to the data. So we've been doing this for 21 years. It started actually with NGOs storming the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle because they dislike globalization. And, you know, given pandemics, it seems like nothing, but here we are 20 years later. So NGOs, we found in year 2000, were the most trusted institution, ahead of business, government, and media, which was the sort of first kind of aha moment. Second big aha was the rise in about 2007 of the trust moving from vertical to horizontal, sort of from top down, the Moses model, to horizontal peer-to-peer, to person like me. I disperse my trust among lots of people, but I do it horizontally. The third big aha actually came about 2012-13, when the mass class divide in opinion started to happen. It took some years after the recovery, because it seemed that the recovery was benefiting the haves more than the have-nots, that the average income of the median wasn't rising at all. And so in the US, the UK, and France, we started to see mass class divide 10 points, 15 points, and growing. I'll tell you more about the world in a moment, but it's becoming transversal. The fourth big trend is the battle for truth. And we started to see in about 2016, people going to their corners, left or right, Fox or MSNBC, and never the twain shall meet. That has accelerated, metastasized, and other into what we call information bankruptcy, which is what we've declared this year. So those are sort of mega trends. And so we should get into the data now. Next slide. So the big story of this year is the rise and then the fall of government. So in fact, in the May mid-year Trust Barometer, we found that in fact, trust in all institutions rose, but trust jumped for government. And government for the first time became the most trusted institution. Why? Because it was a crisis like none since World War II. It was the only institution that we saw having the power and the voice to make the necessary changes. So the UK 24 points up, Canada 20 points, Germany nearly 20 points, like this. And what's happened since May until December is a complete fall of government. And it's on the basis of failing to deliver vaccines in prompt way, calling people back into normal too early, and just disappointment in performance. This is not universally true. For example, in Germany, only 5-point decline from 19 up, but more or less, government gave back its gains. So what's happened, next slide, is that for the first time, business is clearly the most trusted institution in the world. Last year, when I presented at the Executives Club, business and NGOs were tied. This year, business is clearly ahead, well ahead of government and also of media. The key reason, well, next slide. Business is the only institution seen as both ethical and competent. I reiterate, business is nearly 50 points higher than government in terms of competence, and it is reaching toward NGOs on the ethics level. So again, only institution seen as competent and ethical. Big responsibilities given big expectations. Next. Now, I talked about trust having moved from vertical axis, top-down, Moses model, to horizontal, peer-to-peer. With the problems on Facebook and other social platforms, also with the pandemic and disinformation on said platforms, trust has changed. Trust is now local. It means we trust Deputy Mayor Mayakar, but that's a joke. We do, but trust is local. We trust my employer. See that my employer is the mainstay of trust. Understand that my employer is 15 points higher than business in general and 25 points higher than government. So again, that is a universal across the world. Trust moves to the middle. Something I can see, I can also control. Because I work here, I can quit if I don't trust my institution. I don't trust the other institutions because I can't control my relationship. Next. We also see this year a reckoning, a trust reckoning for the two largest economies in the world. China, in the wake of COVID, actually had a trust spike in May. Huge jump, was the #1 in the world, and then has had a precipitous decline. Actually, still #2, but 10 points off of last year and 18 points off of where it was in May. 25 points off for business. For all of you doing business in China, pay attention. The argument between Jack Ma, Ant Financial, and the government is big. Also, the Luckin Coffee accounting scandal. Business does not have good odor at the moment in China. Also, H&A, one of the gray rhinos, has gone bust. So that's one story. But the bigger story for all of us in America is that we are now seeing an American tragedy. In fact, Americans' own confidence in their institutions ranks 3rd lowest in the world, ahead only of Japan, still mired in mental frame about Fukushima, and Russia. This is not good company for America. And just above is the UK. So the UK and America are the two fallen stars over the last 5 years. What's going on in America? Well, I'll tell you. Next slide. There is an absolute collapse of trust among Trump voters since the election. Now, you'll ask what happened in 2016 among the Hillary voters. There was a 6-point drop, but a 13-point drop and 15+ point drops in things like NGOs, government, and media. Look at the delta on media between a Democrat and a Republican, between a Trump voter and a Biden voter. 40 points. For Trump voters, in effect, the media does not exist. It is real Donald Trump or Newsmax, whatever. Jim Kirk will talk about this later, but more or less, the only thing Republicans, Democrats can agree on is we trust business. Again, big responsibility. Trust is local in my company and trust in business. Again, I'll explain more later. Next. The most powerful countries in the world are losing trust. Example, if you have an American jersey on your back, Boeing, Levi Strauss, etc., in the last 7 years, you've seen your trust decline by 25%. It's gone by 62 to 48. We are down there now with Italy and Spain, no longer competing with Germany, Britain, France, etc. at the high end. We are at the middle lower. We're not quite at the level of the Chinese, which define the bottom with the Mexicans and the Indians. Meanwhile, trust in national government is a sad story. The way that people look at the American government, this is again pre the election, is only 40% trust the American government. They trust the Chinese 30, but that's not good company for America. Next. When I talked about the mass class divide, I want you to appreciate that we are now at a place where we have nearly 20-point deltas in places like India, Saudi Arabia, Australia. You know, even in happy Germany, we have a 10-point delta. So in fact, I talk about the mass class divide becoming transversal, that in most of the countries we study, it's in double digits. In many, they have the fodder for populism, nationalism, protectionism, etc. The end of the Trump era is in no way the end of populism. Be clear about that. Next, please. Why? It's all based on fear. Fear of job loss is #1. Last year, we showed you that more than half the people were worried about losing their jobs because of automation. Now it's automation and the pandemic, which clearly people have seen people getting fired in service businesses, etc. Also, climate change. I want you to note that it's a close second to job loss as a major concern. And then third is cyber attacks. Only fourth is contracting COVID. And then last is losing my freedoms as a citizen, privacy. Next. We have a real leadership crisis in the world. We don't trust the classic leaders in society. And this is not just government and CEOs, it's also religious leaders, particularly in the West, now in the 30s, journalists as well. Who is trusted? Scientists. Even if science has somehow been seen as tainted and politicized, science is still revered. Expertise is recognized. But also, again, my employer CEO and people in my local community. Again, trust is local. Next. Leaders are liars. Catch this. Our government leaders are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or grossly exaggerated. More than half the people in the world say this, and people in the West, 65% say this. This is, again, the essence of misinformation. Hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, etc., miracle cures, don't have to wear a mask, miraculous thinking. Next. This is the slide that depresses Jim Kirk. Trust in all information sources are record lows. I want you to particularly look at traditional media, which only 2 years ago was the leading source of information, is now second place to search engines and down 12 points. It's down in the 40s in the Western markets. Social media continues to drag down the entire category. It's in the 20s in the US, UK, etc. Next. Here's a shocker. If you can believe it, a company newsletter, my employer's communication is more credible than national government, reports from major media, or my social media. So again, it's a backward world. It's last person standing. In any case, more responsibility on my corporation to be a primary source of information. Next. What's the implications of all this? Well, Samir knows this well. We have real problems with vaccine hesitancy. In America, we find that 1/3 of people are deeply concerned about taking a vaccine. It's even worse in the African American community and Hispanic community. And so in France, only half the people are willing to get vaccinated, for example. And next, we see a deep connection between poor information hygiene and willingness to get vaccinated. Again, particularly in France, the US, Spain, and the UK, there's 20-point deltas. Those who have poor information hygiene, in other words, single source people, people who share on social stories that they hear or see without checking source. They have bad information hygiene. They represent more than 50% of total information users. Therefore, we are killing ourselves by sharing bad information. Next. Now we get to the punchline. Business has a broader mandate, specifically business to fill the void left by government. CEOs to step in when government doesn't fix societal problems, 68%. CEOs are accountable to the public and not just to shareholders. This is a huge change for business, whether it's about providing information, leading on living wage, or upskilling. Again, this is a moment. Next. CEOs are also expected to speak up, again, on things beyond the four walls of the company. The impact of the pandemic, automation, impact on jobs, societal issues. I mean, local community issues like transportation, return to work. CEOs to the front. And you've seen some of them do so. Alan Jope, for example, of Unilever, promising last week to enforce a living wage, not just on his own, but on his entire supply chain. That's a big change. Or Larry Fink standing up and saying, we're not going to invest in companies that don't have a serious plan to be carbon neutral by 2030. Ariel, maybe we'll want to talk about that. Next. Here's a stunner. The most trust that a company can gain is by guarding information quality. We do not interpret this as privacy. We interpret this as, give me the facts. Help me know so I can decide. And then second is embrace sustainable practices. The ESG aspect of the jersey that's over here, you have to wear and you have to do. Next. So how do we get out of information bankruptcy? Well, the first is business has to embrace its broader mandate. Sustainability, dealing with systemic racism by putting people of color on management and boards, giving them a chance in small business, in supply chain. Also upskilling, do something and then talk about it afterwards. Leading with facts. We have way too much disinformation, but we also have to be clear people are scared. We better talk to them in a way that they can absorb the information. This goes especially for vaccine. I'm interested in what Steve has to say about this, and Kevin too. The idea somehow that, well, of course you'll get vaccinated. The clinical trials indicate everything. Well, all the disinformation about sterility and microchips in the vaccines, people believe some of this stuff, and they also carry the burdens of history. Third, this idea of trustworthy content. Jim, I'm deeply interested in your view on this. Can the media in its shrunken state be enough of a fact and truth carrier without some contribution from Samir and other people to contribute to the fact pattern? I just think surround sound is probably better than you just coming from media. And the last is, I really am concerned by business that thinks it can go it alone. I look at the decision by Dorsey and Zuckerberg about Trump being on Twitter and Facebook, and I think their decision was correct, but it was done without any framework. It was just done in response to, well, he lost the election, I guess we can do this now. And we have to do it. But I really believe in a playing field, and maybe Samir, you'll talk about this. So Captain Kirk, thank you for being our moderator, and I will now pass the baton to you, sir.
Thank you, Richard. That was great as usual, and want to thank the Executives Club of Chicago for putting this on today, as well as Edelman. Good afternoon, everyone. Very glad you could be with us today. We have a terrific conversation planned. We'll spend a little time grilling our panel and then open it up to questions from the audience. So let's start with some introductions of our outstanding panel. First, Ariel Patrick, Chief Communications Officer at Ariel Investments, a global value-based investment firm with $14.6 billion under management. She heads up all aspects of the firm's media relations. Kevin Washington, CEO, YMCA of the USA, the National Resource Office for the Y, which engages with 22 million members annually. Samir Mayakar, Deputy Mayor of the City of Chicago. He oversees neighborhood and economic development for the city. He's also co-founder and CEO of Nanograph Corp, which develops advanced materials for the lithium-ion battery industry. And finally, Steve Nelson, CEO of DuPage Medical Group. He leads the largest independent multi-specialty physician group in the state of Illinois. So welcome, everyone. Very glad to be on the virtual stage with you. First off, we'd like to dig in right away into what Richard was referring to as the information bankruptcy findings of the survey. Clearly the biggest eye openers, at least from my standpoint. And also it's quite possibly the first time we've seen reflected in the results of a survey like this, the two major events that touched virtually everyone's lives. They both converged. It was quite amazing to see how that played out in the results. But one thing that was very clear was this mistrust of information, and the fallout clearly moved to the top as one of the most significant findings. Samir, I want to kind of ask you first, 50% worry that government leaders are purposely trying to mislead people. This presents what has to be a staggering hurdle for local government leaders as they continue to implement COVID-19 safety measures and distribute the vaccine now. How has the mayor's office approached the rise of misinformation over the last year, and what are the takeaways for other leaders? I think you might be muted, Samir.
There we go. Am I unmuted now?
You're good.
Thanks, Jim, for the question. So this is something that we've certainly been dealing with in City Hall, and under Mayor Lightfoot's leadership, what I can say is we've really handled misinformation, and I'll point you to three different topics. The first is, think about the early days of the pandemic. Should you wear a mask or not? Does that prevent transmission? Is this an airborne virus? The second is contact tracing. Does contact tracing work? Can that help predict what industries should be open or not? And then the third, which you just alluded to, is vaccines. Should I take a vaccine? Is it safe? What happens if I only get one shot? Was it rushed through the clinical trial process? And as local government leaders, we've really been handling how to address each one of those. What I'll say in terms of our framework is that the approach here in City Hall has been threefold. The first is that we've had to really lead with scientific experts. And so, while the mayor will be out there speaking about the pandemic, she really turns to Dr. Arwady, our health commissioner here in Chicago, to speak the most on these topics. And I would compare that with the early days of the federal response, where you would see people like Dr. Fauci being muzzled. So I think our first key learning is you need to lead with the scientific experts. The second is that we need to reach people where they are. Part of misinformation is being purposeful with how you communicate. And for us, we've really had to adapt. That means that we've had to communicate and engage in new ways, from social media memes, which you probably saw in the early parts of the pandemic, Facebook that our health commissioner will hold, TikTok videos, radio campaigns, and more recently, we've engaged in door-to-door, peer-to-peer campaigns to help promote mask wearing and vaccination. So the key is that we get information out in a range of mediums to reach targeted audiences. Now, this is probably standard for a lot of you in business, but this was fairly new for city government, and it was new muscle that we had to build. And a very good example of that was our Stay Home, Save Lives campaign, which got a lot of national attention early in the pandemic. So key here is reaching people where they are. And then the third area in terms of how we deal with misinformation is to promote transparency. We've put out so many data portals on how the city's doing with COVID, the number of vaccinations, frequent health updates from health officials, dashboards of metrics, maps of the city with different metrics. That's really tried to help us communicate in a way where people see transparency. So for us, the framework to handling misinformation is leading with the experts, reaching people where they are, and then trying to be as transparent as possible to counter, I think, what we've seen with the federal government. And hopefully, Richard, people don't just lose faith in all government, but that, as you alluded to, they have faith in local levels of government, and that's put unique stresses on us here in City Hall.
Clearly, it was the year where health commissioners became media stars for sure around the country, and we're seeing that playing out locally and the state level as well. Brings us to the question of information sources. Trust in those sources is at a record low, unfortunately. News sources are seen as biased. Employer sources are more believable. This is what the report is telling us. Question for you, Ariel, given your role at Ariel, more than half of the respondents believe that when the news media is absent, corporations have a responsibility to fill that information void, as Richard pointed out. As Chief Communications Officer, what is your reaction to the findings, and how does it affect how you think about your strategies, both internally and externally?
Thanks. Great question. Generally, I would say our experience at the firm has been quite similar to Samir's. So when I say that, I mean taking a more integrated approach and a more stakeholder-focused approach to our communications. So historically, before I joined the firm, client communications were focused in one area, which was dubbed marketing. Philanthropy, community engagement, government affairs was in another silo. Employee communications was managed by HR, and media relations was also in a vacuum of external relations. And generally, what we started to realize is that a more holistic approach to communications helps that you're not only consistent and accurate, but also more focused on the stakeholders that matter to you when approaching your communications. So when I joined, we actually fused all of those together. Now, what was previously 4 to 5 disjointed groups is 1. And so we're really putting the stakeholder first when thinking about how we're delivering information, what we're saying, and also making sure that all of those stakeholders understand our strategy at the same time and in ways that they can understand. The only other thing I'll also say is that one of our main focuses is, as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, is to make sure that we are using our power as shareholders of companies, but also our power as fiduciaries on behalf of our institutional clients to walk the walk. So I think we'll talk a little bit about this later, but part of the reason why I think stakeholders are starting to view the corporate world as more accountable for enacting change is because they're best positioned to very quickly make changes, probably a bit more than the public sector. So again, we can talk about that a bit later, how we're approaching it, but we're in a phase where corporate America is expected to take the lead more so than government, from the general public.
Yes, and clearly both your co-CEOs, John Rogers and Melody Hobson, have been leading, very outspoken on that front, and have sort of led the way on that. And which leads me to another question, both for Ariel and Samir. You know, does the loss of faith in traditional news information resources mean a challenge for City Hall and for companies? Samir, as the mayor tries to get her message out about the vaccine and recovery, it seemed like you would want a news media that is believable if they're reporting on what she's saying.
You know, it is critical to have a healthy news media, and Jim, you know that more so than anyone. What I'll also say is, for us in City Hall, we are trying to build as many direct channels of communication to residents as possible. And so, you know, in the early days of the pandemic, you could see the mayor's social media following on various platforms, you know, balloon up to, I think, over 1 million on the different platforms. And we have an ambition in City Hall to be able to reach almost every resident through some form of direct communication, whether that be something they see on the sidewalk, whether that's through social media, whether that's through, you know, email and newsletters, whether that's through text campaigns, so that we can, you know, rely less on what can be sometimes distortionary information filters. And I would never accuse that of Cranes, Jim, but you know, it's important for us to be able to communicate directly if we're to compensate for the misinformation environment out there.
I totally agree. And I think rather than view it as a challenge, I actually view it as an opportunity. We're really owning our own story and focusing on own channels as a way to speak to stakeholders directly. And again, no offense to you or my father, who's a journalist, by the way, so totally no offense there, but it is an opportunity for companies to build their own channels. And I actually think the pandemic has forced us to get a bit more creative about how to do that.
Yeah, and you know, we could go on about, I also have some ideas about how we could change things on the media side, but time is short here, but we'll maybe get into that later. I want to talk a little bit about the recovery and the vaccine, specifically the vaccine hesitancy, which you know, clearly the path to rebuild comes with the rebuilding of trust in the vaccines. Steve, wondering if I could point this to you. You know, the results show that only 64% of global respondents are willing to get a COVID vaccine at the moment, and only 1 in 3 are willing to get it as soon as possible. So what is the role of each institution, from providers to employers to business, government, and media, in overcoming this hurdle of hesitancy around the vaccine?
Well, thanks for the easy question, Jim. First, I just want to go back into this conversation about owning your own story. I actually love that concept, and I'm actually think this is a huge opportunity for organizations, both healthcare and I sit in a chair as a healthcare organization and an employer, you know. So, but I think it does create a huge opportunity. So in terms of vaccine hesitancy, you know, it's been frustrating and somewhat surprising to me, particularly as I think about our employee base. They're knowledgeable, well-educated, thoughtful healthcare workers who are in the middle of treating COVID positive patients, and we still see a fairly sizable hesitancy. So we've given our 1,000 physicians almost, and you know, 6,000 employees all the opportunity to take advantage of the vaccine, and we're at about 60s, trending towards 65%. So about the average, you know, which I thought it would. I really did think it was going to be higher. And so then you sort of go right to, okay, what is the you know, communication gap, or the you know, information hygiene issue, or what is it, you know? And so and I know, you know, Ariel will appreciate this, but as we go as a CEO, as an employer, my most valued, underappreciated asset in my organization right now is internal communications. But what we're learning is that you can't use the old playbook. You've got to use the new playbook, which is it can't just be volume. It has to be quality, and it can't just come from me. But I need to recruit my employee base to tell the story as well. So this is our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. This is our physician staff. These are thought leaders inside our company, and it needs to be high quality, needs to be frequent, and needs to be multi-channel. So that's sort of the employer, aspect to it. From a healthcare, provider perspective, I know, Samir will join me in this. We need more vaccine, and we need less rules. And then let me just say more about that. We're sort of in the middle of a frustrating situation, I would call it, where it feels like we don't have direct access. I can't do what I normally do to source, healing drugs, and I'm going to put vaccine in that category. We just don't have that sort of direct communication. We will, but right now we don't. And then once we do get it, there's barriers to distributing it. And so I think, my request and sort of my urge, to sort of everyone is we need to get more vaccine, and then we as healthcare providers need to be empowered to get that to the people. And so, kind of acting boldly, Jim, and, being respectful of the rules and the tiers and things that are important. But I'll give you just a quick example, and then I'll get off my soapbox here. But, we had a situation the other day where we got to the end of the day and we had no more appointments, and we had a couple of doses of vaccine left. And due to this was a few weeks ago now, so this was the Pfizer, and we were going to need to, if we couldn't get that into somebody's arm, we were going to need to throw that away. And so our staff was like, okay, what do? We don't have any more appointments. There's a super strict hierarchy. And so one very empowered, thoughtful physician got in our appointment system, and in that one facility where we're doing the vaccines, found someone that was in the building, our patient, who he thought this person seemed like a good candidate to me, even though they don't meet the exact criteria, and they are not, they didn't make an appointment. Found them, elderly person who he thought made a lot of sense, asked her, hey, would you be interested in getting the vaccine today, right now? She said, absolutely, and we did it. So you might say, okay, hey, you broke the rules, but this is where we need to take some bold moves and feel empowered and give the people who are experts the opportunity. This kind of fits with Samir's comment about trust the science and sort of get out of politics. And so that's what I'm advocating for. So I kind of have this unique view where it's we have an employer. As an employer, we have a group of workers that we're trying to protect. But as a person in the middle of the healthcare ecosystem, it's been a frustrating situation. So there's a lot of work to do in how we think about this.
Yeah, really remarkable stories like that of doctors not wanting to waste one vaccine and having to make some big choices on making sure that those get into arms. It's got to be incredibly exhilarating and frustrating at the same time. And Steve, while I have you there thinking about this, looking beyond the pandemic recovery, what challenges and opportunities lie ahead in rebuilding trust in our public healthcare system?
Yeah, I think I'm going beyond vaccines now, but access and equity we have to be hyper focused on that. We need to go over the top on access and equity. And I mean, a vaccine, I think, and the pandemic has pushed this even more to the forefront, than it was, which is great actually. But we need to leverage this now. So, for example, we as an organization, as we think about risk scores for potential people who get the vaccine, as a learning, we added race and ethnicity to our risk scores, in addition to all the other things that you might think about. And we're taking that framework and applying that to other things, including social terms of health. And so another, barriers to the vaccine that people didn't really think about, obviously transportation, but do you have access to, internet so you can get into the scheduling appointments that you need to get in because of the sort of the rules around it. And these little things are sort of emerging as opportunities for us to solve. And so I'm actually very excited about some of the issues that have been surfaced, but I think access and equity is at the forefront. I think this other idea about information is critical. And one of the things that we've learned is at the end of the day, there's so much noise out there in healthcare. And even the scientists, there's a little bit of skepticism around, well, is Fauci really a scientist, or is he like a political spokesperson, or, to the sort of common person who's just kind of trying to figure it out. People trust their doctors, and so let's double down on that. And how do we do that? How do we give physicians and caregivers the right information and the scripts and the talking points to help and be proactive about, what they talk about, how they talk about it, and go beyond, I know you're here to check on your diabetes, but let me have a conversation about A, B, and C. This might be helpful to you. So these are the kinds of things that, we're thinking about. And I think the future is bright. I think this is I really look at this last year as an opportunity for healthcare to get better.
Great. I want to turn to the societal issues that surface in the survey. And one of the takeaways in this year, like no other, is that trust in societal leaders decline further. Government leaders, religious leaders, CEOs, journalists, the trust keeps eroding. Kevin, I wanted to ask you, as CEO of the YMCA, and you've spoken about your vision for equity and inclusion across the communities you serve. Can you talk a little bit about that vision? What does it look like, and what actions is the organization taking to get there?
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Wanted to also echo Richard's comments about local. As an organization that's nationally in scope and been around for 170 years, it is the local entity that helps us define our ability to build trust in those communities in which we serve, which is over 10,000. But we define equity as the guarantee of treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for everyone. Where individuals are not at a disadvantage from achieving their potential because of their background or social position. That's how we define equity. But we're an American institution. The Y has been around since 1851. And we are a reflection of our society in many ways across that spectrum. But when we talk about racism and how we're adjusting it, we know that the YMCA can broadly and effectively address systemic racism in communities, but we need to start with ourselves. And that's the journey that we're on. We're on a journey to be an anti-racist, multicultural anti-racist organization. That's the journey that we want. And what does that mean? We're working on many fronts: operational practices, procedures, hiring, staff leadership pipeline, skill, and competency development. But we're starting with ourselves. What does that mean? We've engaged the People's Institute out of New Orleans to help train some of our organization leaders about what has happened to our organization. There's a lot of folks about our history. They don't know how we got here. So it is important for folks to understand that before we can address that, not only individually, but from a community perspective. And for our organization, there's been some really interesting conversations internally about how we do that work. But the other thing I say is we meet communities where they are. We meet. The community in Chicago is going to be very different than the community in Duluth, Iowa. And we have organizations in both of those places and leaders in both of those places. We arm them with the same kind of tools and resources, but we allow them to tenure them to the communities in which they sit. This is a journey for us, and one that we will continue to be on to, that as an organization, level that we have, we can use those tools, resources, and people to help make some systemic changes in our organization. And part of it, of course, is representation. People have to see people like me in positions like this and recognize that they can advance. So all of those are part of our journey, long journey, because like I said, took us 400 years to get here, and it's not going to change around overnight.
And Kevin, really quickly, how do you, seeing the phase that's starting to shift from the initial panic around safety and the economic fallout to the vaccine and recovery at the very local level, are you seeing the strains that we're seeing nationally and what Steve talked about as well in terms of hesitancy and those sorts of issues?
Couple of things. Yes. Remember now, Black people of color in this country have a long history with the medical system that's not a positive one, and that doesn't eradicate overnight. So that's an important aspect. We have been engaged with pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies to help be a barrier to help that process work. For instance, I took my shot the other day. Absolutely got it right in my arm, and be right there to share with folks that it is safe. But I am not a medical institution. I cannot vouch for its safety because that's not who we are. But we can say that we believe we can help provide access to those communities. And that's the process upon which we're taking. Finally, I would say, like anything else, that the pandemic has devastated the organization collectively, financially. But our assets and time to do work around providing child care for emergency workers, food distribution at 1,100 sites. We did blood drives, all of those things to help position the Y as that vital community asset. And so as we go down this vaccine distribution, that trust level is still there, and the opportunity to partner with others to ensure that the marginalized, or those folks who have that vaccine hesitancy, has an opportunity to get. In fact, I got mine at a church. The Black doctors in Philadelphia have been on the forefront of doing this work. And they were at churches giving out significant numbers of vaccines to people who probably would not have gotten access to that. So we need all of those, all of us in that process to help ensure that the majority of our folks get the vaccination that they severely need so we can tackle this pandemic.
Great.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, Steve, could I just sort of jump on the point that you made, Kevin, around your kind of voice in building trust, maybe in healthcare or other things. You know, one of the things that I'm struck by over this past year, but also just sitting in this conversation, is, you know, this trust is local idea. I'm curious of how it works when different local kind of come together to even be a stronger local voice. And I think there's some potential power in that when we think about and it could include media outlets as well, you know, but this idea of how do we partner together locally to be, you know, even a more powerful local, hopefully trusted voice. I think that's a interesting, you know, idea that is worth exploring as we, you know, and I get that you can't vouch for, am I doing a good job, you know, injecting vaccines, but you could help me tell the story about, hey, this is important. The science is there. Public health matters. You can participate in this. This is how you do it, and then, you know, then leave it to us to kind of prove that out. But I love the idea of kind of combining together, and Samir, obviously a ton of opportunity, you know, mayor's office and then other corporations, you know. So, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Richard, I know you're dying to say something.
Well, Jim, the only thing I want to say is, I think that the sort of first thing that companies have been doing is trying to change their businesses. This is not something that's philanthropic. This is something that actually change your supply chain. Investment firms change your investment philosophy. The actions by certain companies on living wage is a big deal. The actions by other companies, and I commend Samir and team on, you know, the connections between the community colleges and the companies. This is, you know, giving us upskilling. and the potential for better. And Yum Brands saying that we'll provide the equity for African American or Hispanic who are running stores, don't have the money to put up and buy a franchise. We'll do the equity, and then you go borrow the money and become a franchisee. Bravo. You know, I just think business is now pushing itself forward, and CEOs are also speaking up on living wage and things like this. This is a different time. That historically has been, oh, government's got that. Well, government can only do it if business says it's okay, you know, and they're not fighting it. And bigger companies are going to drag the smaller companies along, because the small guys say, we can't afford this, we can't afford this, bad time to raise minimum wages. Well, last time I did the math, if you just do $7.50 an hour, it winds up being like $16,000. That's not exactly a living wage, just to say. So again, it's a different time. And I really urge everyone on this call to push your CEOs to be front and center, because your employees will only work at companies where they believe that the company has a mission. And on systemic racism in particular, if you don't speak up in the context of the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd about what you've done specifically to change, I think it's a huge miss for the company.
And more so than it being a miss or do-gooderism, it will soon become a responsibility, right? So what do shareholders want? What do stakeholders want? Two things: transparency and results. So historically, if you were a CEO and you missed earnings guidance or didn't, fail to execute on a strategic plan, you were done. Now we're finally getting to the point where it's no longer acceptable to keep falling short on DEI commitments and other related things, because it's alpha generating for the business, and also it's the right thing to do. So I'm hopeful that, as firms like ours and, the rest of the financial community use their power as shareholders to make that abundantly clear to companies, I think that is when we'll actually see change. But until there's a perception that it's not just philanthropy, but actually an alpha generating opportunity to do what's right, I think we'll remain in this limbo where it's always, we're working on it, we're trying, we're almost there, instead of what are the metrics, how do we measure this, and how far have you gone?
But I've also seen a lot of corporations take advantage of the opportunity from a advertising and positioning perspective with no substance behind it. And I firmly believe that because of the younger generation, that will not fly. It has to be sincere, and it has to be measurable, and they have to see demonstrated outcome, not just a commercial, not just we're doing this. And a lot of companies, I think, have jumped on that bandwagon with commercials, but I haven't seen the substance behind it.
Yeah, Kevin, I no, that strikes me too, and I got to tell you, and just to be super transparent, sort of vulnerable in this forum, it's just the six of us, right? That's no, I know it's not, but I think there's a talk track that goes through your mind, when you're trying to figure out, do you take a position or not, because you're like, okay, if I just kind of pour my heart out, my feelings, people are like, oh, that's a beautiful note, but it doesn't really mean anything, but it needs to be your heart, your authentic sort of view on things. Then therefore we are going to take these actions, and I think trying to figure out how to make the actions meaningful, and knowing that you're going to get it wrong a few times, just because it's complicated, it's sensitive, there's a lot of different views, and people are super passionate about them. I think it sometimes makes organizations and CEOs sort of double down on being cautious. It's like, we're just going to stay out of this, and so I think that I don't know, Richard, Ariel, if you guys have a point of view, but I actually think kind of getting in there and making some mistakes, but actually advancing the conversation and connecting words with action is better than sort of taking the cautious route. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, Steve, we actually have data. We have data on this because, and Ariel knows this, we did a study in June and again in August in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and we found that companies that spoke up and brands that spoke up got 10x trust rise for African Americans, 5x for Hispanics, 4 for white, Republicans twice, Democrats 7 times. So actually, statistically, you are safe and smart to do it. Not just that it's in your heart, but it's in your mind. And Ariel, sorry I cut you off.
No. I mean, it's more than saying things though, right? We all know that what gets measured gets done. So the same frameworks that companies use to develop strategic plans and outline to their shareholders what they want to meet from a financial perspective can also be achieved from a DEI perspective. So the first part is, if you want to be a world-class organization, you can't really escape your responsibility anymore from showing real measurable results. But the first step is actually outlining what those metrics are and just setting a goal. The other thing that I would say is speaking out is good, even if, and at least be transparent about the fact that there is nothing behind it yet, right? So I hate reading CEO letters where there's all this heartfelt, but no one actually admits, listen, we know we're not there yet. And we're seeking counsel from the community, we're listening, we're in listening mode. And after that, we'll come back to you with what we've designed.
And I also think that we should be very clear that there's such a thing as belief-driven buyers. And it's more prevalent of younger, it's more prevalent perhaps of African-American, but again, more than half African-Americans said, if you stand up and speak up, I will change my brand purchase. I will do that. So again, it makes the cash register ring. That's good for capitalism.
Great. Well, we are getting close to the end here. I want to do a lightning round, so, as I like to do in these panels. I want to hear from each of you just very quickly, kind of a bold prediction. Next year at this time, where do you want or expect to see the biggest change in sentiment, whether it be business or government or healthcare or media? Samir, you want to start us off?
Well, of course, I'll predict that people will have tremendous amounts of trust in local government. That will continue. My prediction is one of the silver linings of a very difficult year is how we've always had this history in Chicago of close interaction between the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. I think the pandemic has pushed those even closer, and I'm excited a year from now that hopefully we will all be standing here together talking about some of these corporate commitments, government commitments, nonprofit commitments to really make good on investing more in disinvested neighborhoods and focusing more on racial equity and turning around those decades of disinvestment. So I think if we fast forward a year, if we take advantage of that momentum, that's where I hope we'll be a year from now.
Great. Ariel?
My biggest hope is that we see less lip service and more elbow grease on the matter that is DEI. And I'm actually confident that we will. So that I'll leave it there, but.
Great. Yep. Kevin.
Wow. Big thing. One, hopefully we'll have 80% of our population vaccinated against this pandemic. We need that. If we don't do that, we will not move forward. And the second thing is, and I'm social oriented, I want to see the government do the $15 an hour process. I think it's well past time for us to move to $15 an hour to ensure that people have at least a living wage.
Steve.
I like everything these guys said. I've always been a huge fan of private-public partnerships, and I think we need more of that. So, but I do think that things that we're just that have sort of bubbled to the surface will be more commonplace a year from now. So measuring and really good data on health inequities will be common, I think, in a year from now. Now, I think action sort of will trail that a bit still, but I think we will have have better visibility into it, and we'll be a lot smarter about it. And I also think things like, and I would put, living wage and other things that dramatically affect people's health that have not been considered in the traditional framework of healthcare will become common healthcare metrics like living wage. Living wage is actually a direct determinant of your health. and people don't make that connection a lot. And so those kinds of connections, I think, will be more commonplace a year from now.
Hey, Kevin, I'm going to point out we're going to $15 here in Chicago. That was accelerated by a year this summer.
Bravo.
Lead the charge. Lead the charge.
Jim, my prediction is that we're going to make real strides on coming out of information bankruptcy. I think that there will be federal regulation of the platforms. I think that there will be a serious effort by government. For example, I know World Business Chicago has, Samir, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 1 million people are reading a sort of biweekly newsletter kind of thing that's coming out, and it's becoming a primary source of information, and that's really impressive. I also think companies will recognize that they all have to become media companies, that, whether you're DuPage Medical or Ariel, you all have something to say, and it's going to be adjacent to what Jim says and other mainstream media, but will help overcome falsehood. And I think all of us are going to have to interrupt disinformation and make it part of our responsibility to get quality facts in front of people, because otherwise we're screwed.
Good point.
I'll add that local news organizations are a big part of that. So that's my
And
plug.
I hope that also we get to a place, which Cranes does, of more fact and less opinion.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you guys all. It was a terrific conversation. We could have gone 2 more hours at least. So thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, and to Edelman, and to the Executives Club of Chicago, and to you, all of you. Thank you for coming out here today, actually sitting there and listening in on this great conversation. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.